Quem tem uma empresa sabe quanto tempo é valioso. Por isso, a Apex Brasil apoia empresas brasileiras que querem exportar seus produtos, atrair investimentos estrangeiros ou empreender no exterior. Com a Apex Brasil, as empresas brasileiras têm um apoio estratégico para mandar seus produtos e serviços para fora do país de uma forma inteligente e segura. Com métodos inovadores, parcerias, soluções inteligentes, visão de mercado, conteúdos estratégicos e muita qualificação, a Apex Brasil é referência na promoção de exportações, internacionalização de empresas e atração de investimentos estrangeiros. A agência também atua de forma coordenada com atores públicos e privados em setores estratégicos, tanto para o desenvolvimento da competitividade das empresas quanto para o fortalecimento da economia brasileira. Se é conexão com o mundo de oportunidades no mercado internacional que a sua empresa procura, é o apoio da Apex Brasil que ela precisa. Acesse o mundo. Acesse a Apex Brasil.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. I am Renato Godinho. I co-chair this BBEST-Biofuture conference, and I am the chair of the Biofuture platform. I hope you have enjoyed our opening session, high-level speakers, followed by the keynote session with very important and crucial content on the role of bioenergy in the coming decades. So we are now pleased to introduce to you our first live webinar of this conference. And it is on a very crucial subject that you have already seen touched upon in the previous keynotes and openings. This is about biomass quantification and sustainability governance. How to achieve consensus on this matter. So I will, before introduce a range of highly qualified speakers to tackle this very difficult subject, I'm going to do a short presentation to you to highlight what is at play. So, next slide, please. This is taken from the presentation of Paulo Frankel that you have seen in the keynotes. The IEA has just launched the Net Zero Roadmap. This is a momentous historic report showing what needs to be done for the world to achieve a path of net emissions neutrality by 2050. And this is the role of biomass in it. So it calls for 100 exajoules of modern biomass by 2050. No new fossil investments starting now. And then bioenergy, modern bioenergy, discounting all of the traditional use of biomass that needs to be phased out. We need to meet almost 20% of total energy needs, becoming the second largest source of energy supply. So next slide. This is not only the IEA, so IRENA also in a very recent report on a 1.5 degree scenario, it also found that bioenergy plays an essential role, not only in the short term or in a transition term, but an essential mid and long-term role along with hydrogen. You can see it's very similar. Its modern biomass supplies about 18% of the final energy use in 2050 in this scenario, and is responsible for more than half of all captured carbon along with CCS for a total of 65 gigatons of CO2 removed cumulatively from today until 2050. So there is a need for multiplication of bioenergy. Next slide. And it needs to be sustainable, and we need to make it happen, and we need to make it fast. But can we? Let me introduce you in the next slide to a small back of the envelope calculation that I made to show you the scales that we are talking about. At a very macro level, what are the scales we're talking about? One of our panelists that unfortunately had an emergency, last-minute emergency, and won't be able to join us today, but Marion from the Packard Foundation was telling me that the matter of bioenergy sustainability is a matter of scale. So let's look at the scales we're talking about here. This square represents the amount of fossil carbon that is emitted every year. This is on the peak year of 2019, 8.6 billion tons of fossil carbon. This is atomic weight carbon, it's not CO2. So this is why the weight is reduced from the numbers that you know. So we need to compare actual carbon atoms here in this exercise. Next. It seems like a lot, but if you put it back to the amount of biomass produced by nature every year, it doesn't seem so much anymore. So this is not the stock of carbon of nature, mind you. This is every year the amount of carbon that nature produces and then reabsorbs in its own natural cycle. This is to have a look at the scales here. Next slide. And these are the emissions specifically from the transportation sector, close to 2 billion tons of carbon per year, also in the peak. Next slide. This is difficult to estimate, but this is a very good ballpark projection of what the IEA net zero roadmap that I just shown you would call around in terms of carbon of biomass to be used per year to achieve the results that we need to achieve for net zero. So 1 gigaton of biomass carbon per year that needs to be used sustainably to achieve those results. Next slide. So what the conclusion is that in the natural carbon cycle of nature, you just need to tap into a tiny portion, use the carbon that would be naturally released, use it to produce useful energy materials, and release it again into nature. And just by doing that, you can not only displace fossil fuel emissions, but also promote carbon capture and achieve negative emissions, having a huge impact on emissions reductions in the long range. So this is the scale we are talking about. Next slide. So can we achieve it? Looking at that, those comparisons, it certainly seems possible, but indeed, bioenergy remains controversial. This matter of scale is still something that is very contentious even among scientists and among policymakers and among organizations. So there are different views that maybe relate to different assumptions, different approaches, even sharing the same logics that need to be worked on. So we feel there is enough knowledge around the world, there is enough data, but the assumptions and points of departure and expectations are not the same, and we need to try and have an alignment on what is needed on sustainability and feedstock availability. So you have also seen this message very strongly in the presentation by Paulo Frankel in his keynote, and also in the opening statements from Brazil and from the US, with the US, the Vice Energy Secretary, David Turk, also putting this forging consensus on this arena as one of the priorities for the United States going next as chair of the Biofuture platform. Next slide. So these are the main priorities of the Biofuture platform in general. The next. You can see that forging consensus on biomass sustainability governance is one of them. And this is one that we need to really kickstart right now. We have been receiving lots of messages from many circles that this is a priority for the world indeed, in order for the investments to be unlocked. Next slide. So, what do we envisage? A collective effort of international initiatives, each one contributing with its own knowledge, its own capacity. This is not exclusive. This is not all comprehensive. Surely there are a lot of other stakeholders that already work on this, have interest, have knowledge that will also be able to contribute. And our idea here is, can we get all this knowledge and work that has been done in this field by a number of countries and stakeholders and organize it in a coherent form so that we can get from this process, I don't know how long it will take, with a better idea of more convergence on exactly how much biomass we have available for sustainably developing the bioeconomy and how to develop it. Next slide. So this is just a few basic ideas that I wanted this panel to discuss on how to successfully forge consensus in this very complex subject with many approaches, many angles of biomass sustainability governance. So one is of inclusion, so you need to have the right actors and not staying in specific opinion bubbles. But you also have to have good faith collaboration. So the idea is to really be open-minded about this, able to question your own previous positions and able to accept evidence within the logic that we are putting forward. And this leads to the third principle. This process is so complex that it needs to be well sequenced, well structured. Maybe the old saying goes that you take a complex problem, you break it down in parts so that you can better approach this. It needs, this goes without saying, be evidence-based, based on the most available knowledge that is in the academia. And also, last but not least, needs to be policy and goal-oriented. So the idea here is not only to build academic knowledge. This is the BioFuture platform is not an academic or a scientific institution, but it's a platform for learning and policy debate. So the idea is that the consensus is poised to orient policy and have goals that we need to achieve based on what we found on how to proceed on sustainability governance of biomass. Next slide. So to conclude my brief introduction and leave you to the panelists, I put forward here a few of the guiding questions that I wanted this panel to try and approach. We, of course, won't have all the responses in this panel. This is not the idea. This panel is not about to solve this problem that this debate that have been decades raging around. But it is a starting point on the best ideas on how to approach the problem and how can we eventually solve this. So these are a few of the questions. Scale, what are the assumptions that people use to find different scales of availability of that biomass? How we set or define sustainable for our purposes? What are the best instruments? At what level? Is it country, national, project level? Countryside. So how do we do this? Do we have already all the necessary knowledge, or do we need to go and do some more empirical research here and there to fill some gaps? What about negative land use change? So emissions from land use change, it's a key part of this debate. How to approach, how to deal with it. There are very, very different approaches also that maybe we need to have more convergence. And especially, how to bring worldwide legitimacy and convergence so around these results. So we can find all the best answers, but if no one buys into them, this won't be useful for many people in many circles around the world. So this is also very crucial. This is my brief introduction. I wish now to introduce our high quality range of speakers that to try to give their perspectives on this subject. We have here Gerald Scheimer, the founder and CEO of the BioFuture Workshop. Gerald is working with the BioFuture Platform Facilitator in the International Energy Agency to organize what we're calling the BioFuture Campaign, a link with the private sector's facilitator. Michela Morese, she's the Executive Secretary of GBEP, Global Bioenergy Partnership. If you can please return to all cameras, good. She's been working on leading the Secretariat of GBEP, an institution that has many member countries and organizations that has worked a lot in the field of sustainability of bioenergy and will have a lot of experience to contribute. Professor Glaucia Souza, which is also a co-chair of this conference with me, so I'm very pleased to have her here. She's also the coordinator of the FAPEST Bioenergy Program, and we'll talk about the experience of the Scope Bioenergy and Sustainability Report, a major report that she helped coordinate that brings a lot of knowledge to this field. Keith Klein from the Oak Ridge Laboratory in the United States. So his research identifies approaches that support beneficial land management, sustainable development goals, has more than 24 years of experience in also working with countries to practically support management, biodiversity, soil and water. And last but not least, we have Inge Stupak, professor at the University of Copenhagen, that is also one of the leaders in the IEA Bioenergy Task 45 on climate and sustainability effects of bioenergy. So this IEA Bioenergy is also an institution that will have a lot to contribute to this process. And Inge also managed Intertask project on sustainability governance of bioenergy, and we have a lot to say. But we'll get to them one by one. I wish to first give the floor to Gerhard Ostheimer, who will provide us with what he assessed from the private sector views when he was putting together the BioFuture campaign on this matter of sustainability of biomass. Jerry.
Thank you very much, Renato. And I would like to take some time to put the issue of sustainability, which is frequently treated in an appropriately scientific and technical way. And I would like to actually think about sustainability in the context of the economic development that Paulo Frankel mentioned in his plenary speech. In fact, I strongly recommend that you have a look at Paulo's comments, which are referencing the recently released IEA roadmap to net zero by 2050. Paulo was extremely clear on IEA's recommendations, and Paulo was also extremely clear that one of the key concepts that we're looking for is innovation. Innovation requires investment, which brings us to the concept of investor confidence. And sustainability, particularly in the BioFuture, is about creating investor confidence. And so one could imagine a triangle of a virtuous cycle in which clarity on sustainability improves policy stability, increases investor confidence, and we drive that cycle and we get to the levels of acceleration of deployment that are absolutely needed to achieve our net zero future. And so I'm not going to go into the technical details, but I'm going to continue to build on Renato's remarks about framing sustainability governance and reporting. Next slide, thank you. So I'm going to start with a story, actually, and that story is the story of the large shipping company and we could say a company that has very ambitious sustainability goals, which is the Danish company Maersk. And as recently as this April, the managing director of Maersk Singapore said, going forward, we will only order ships which have zero carbon emissions capability. And in fact, having spoken with some of the leadership of Maersk, I know that 3, 4, 5 years ago, Maersk was, and probably even before, Maersk was looking at this issue of their equipment and what are their options for decarbonization. And they told me that they are more than happy to use biofuels. They see biofuels as a reasonable approach, as not just a bridge, but as a long-term fuel well into the future. But there was a problem, which is Maersk would approach some of these suppliers of fuels and say, how much can we buy? And the suppliers of fuels would say, we don't know, which is a very strange answer. Maersk is very much used to dealing with on-demand supply of its fuel. It has to have a clear supply chain of fuel. And the reason that we can't say how much fuel and biofuel we're going to have is we don't have clarity on the sustainability. And as Renato pointed out, we don't have clarity on the amount of fuel that we're going to produce because we don't have clarity on how much feedstock we're going to be able to prepare. Next slide. In the past 2 years, we have seen a massive proliferation of net zero campaigns. There's a number of actors from the public sector side, the international organization side, the civil society side, and there's a number of business-led efforts. Race to Zero is being driven by some of the partnerships under the UNFCCC. The Climate Group and their RE100, EV100, EP100 programs have been operating for several years now. The We Mean Business Coalition continues to move forward, and then there are some additional actors in this space, including Amazon, which is driving this climate pledge, which is net zero by 2040. In addition, we have Climate Action 100, which has been extremely influential in driving investor relationship to decarbonization. So Climate Action 100 is pulling in investors, setting frameworks for decarbonization, and forcing investors to look at the behavior of the companies they invest in, which is driving a feedback around reporting, which is looking more broadly at the topic of sustainability. Next slide. And if we look at some of the other leaders in this space, there has been new actors in the biofuture advocacy space. And so the World Economic Forum, in partnership with the Energy Transitions Commission and the Rocky Mountain Institute, have created what they call Mission Possible, which is all about decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors. And one of the sectors that is really moving forward with a lot of interest and a lot of public momentum is the issue of sustainable aviation fuels, SAF. And so the World Economic Forum with its partners created an activity called Clean Skies for Tomorrow. And you can see their membership here, which is rather significant. And so they have a steering committee composed of people that use the fuels, people that produce the fuels. They have a number of knowledge partners. They have the advisory partners from some of the long-standing actors in the SAF space. And then they have a whole plethora of additional producers, consumers, and investors. I think it is incredibly important that entities like BlackRock, Google are involved because they're actually making the investments. And so in order for all of this to move forward, there needs to be increasing confidence in the sustainability of these low carbon fuels. Next slide. So I understand it's a bit hard to read, but the Clean Skies for Tomorrow, because sustainability is fundamental to the success of their program, they worked with McKinsey to develop their perspective on sustainability. And so what we've seen a bit in this, as sustainable investing has taken hold, as new actors have entered into the biofuture space, we've seen a bit of dispersion. We've seen some scattering. We've seen new actors coming in and, I would argue, reinventing the wheel a little bit and trying to come to grips with this topic of sustainability. And so the Biofuture Platform Initiative and the Biofuture campaign that I'm helping to create and co-manage, we have a very important role to get different actors instead of looking at more and more different ideas, to bring that conversation together so that we can achieve what I would like to call interoperability between approaches to sustainability. As we will hear from our other panelists, there are a number of approaches to sustainability. Sustainability is frequently locally determined, but in order to have high functioning markets, we need to create a fair bit of interoperability. And the problem is that, and it's actually represented here, I can't really point to it, but that first layer of first generation feedstocks have largely been discounted in this report. I think that there's a lot of data that there are intelligent ways to use vegetable oils, but they've just been written off. And this is a huge missed opportunity to drive sustainable investment into that sector. And so here I would say in this case that this report is driving, unfortunately, a bit of negative feedback. And instead, we need to return to more of a technically sound, rational planning approach that can take into account all the contributions from all the feedstocks and to think this through. Next slide. As I said, we have this increasing constellation of actors, numerous actors now from financial rating agencies, growing reporting frameworks, and a hierarchy of governing principles. It's absolutely essential that the BioFuture campaign interact with these leaders in the broader sustainable investment space and achieve, like I said, that clarifying interoperability in approaches to sustainability. Next slide. Interestingly, this idea of new entrants causing a dispersion of approaches is something I think that we in the sustainable bioenergy feedstock space are very familiar with, right? So there's a number of challenges right now for the broader sustainability discussions. There's now a large number of frameworks. There's fragmentation across jurisdictions. One only needs to look at from the bioenergy space, from the policies of Brazil, US, and Europe to see examples of fragmentation. But now this fragmentation is happening across all of sustainability. And so people have recognized this as inefficient, this is costly, and we need to figure out how to move forward in a coherent way. Next slide. So this is my last slide, and as I said, what we are trying to achieve is a level of interoperability, and we're trying to create a productive dialogue on sustainability with new entrants into the sector. And so if the BioFuture is going to fully contribute to a net zero future, if we are going to have the full-blown circular economy that we desire, then the entire economy needs to understand the potential for bio and waste-based feedstocks to contribute to our broader decarbonization and circularity goals. So for any of you out there listening, next slide, I invite you to contact me to learn more about the campaign, learn how to contribute to the campaign, and learn how to work with us and the broader BioFuture initiative, and most importantly, the broader clean energy, ministerial clean energy community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry, for this presentation, which I believe before, not just putting forward the details of the campaign that you are helping to organize, but also setting some very practical examples of why we need this, increased convergence on the topic of quantification of biomass and sustainability. And I think between Jerry and myself, we have pretty much highlighted the problem. So now let's start to look at some of the instruments and solutions that different organizations have been putting forward over the last years. And here's when I pass the floor on to Michela Moresi from GBEP. GBEP has, among many other things, worked on a well-known set of sustainability indicators. Let's hear from that experience and what could be next. Michela. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your very nice introduction and also for the very good consideration that we've heard from you and from Jerry that represents also a stimulus for further discussion. In my presentation, I will give an overview of the experience, as you said, of the experience of the Global Bioenergy Partnership regarding how the sustainability governance of bioenergy could be approached, could be set. Next, please. For those of you who are not familiar with the Global Bioenergy Partnership, the GBEP is an international initiative. It was established in light of a G8 commitment in 2005. It was established the year after, in 2006. And since then, we've started receiving renewed mandates, both from the G7 and G8 and from the G20. Brazil is currently the chair. The co-chair is under nomination, and FAO is one of the founding partners of the partnership and also hosts its secretariat in the FAO headquarters in Rome. And as you may see from the screen, from the slide, we have around more than 80 between partners and observers, between governments and international organizations as of today. Next one, please. Since the very beginning, in GBEP, we have considered that sustainability is a priority. We know, we are keenly aware that modern bioenergy presents excellent opportunities, but not without challenges. And the key, the importance of trying to get out the best from the opportunity is exactly to look at the sustainability. Next, please. So sustainability has been, as I said, a priority of GBEP since the very beginning. It has implied a long working activity within the partnership in discussions, technical discussion, and also political discussion within the GBEP membership in order to achieve a very important result, which is a set of 24 sustainability indicators, those that you see on the screen. 24 sustainability indicators, 8 under each of the 3 pillars of sustainable development. And these also wanted to be a very strong message in the sense that sustainability is only achieved if equal importance is given to the 3 pillars of sustainable development. The use of these, the objective of the measurement of these indicators is to inform policy making about important policies, for example, that could support the further sustainable development of bioenergy. And if measured over time, these indicators may give to policymakers ideas and information on how to further adjust the national policies. Next one, please. These indicators could be applied to any types of bioenergy. As we said, the objective is to inform and guide policy making towards a sustainable development of bioenergy. It's important also to say that these indicators are voluntary. They do not feature directions or thresholds, and they were developed and agreed among the GBEP partners not to constitute a standard. And I have to say that maybe the added value of these indicators is exactly the fact that they are voluntary. And this voluntary tool gave us the opportunity to apply and implement these indicators as much as possible in as many countries as possible so far, in order to somehow harmonize the way we consider a sustainability assessment of bioenergy, and therefore to guide related policies accordingly. Next one, please. Well, so far the GBEP indicators have been implemented in more or less 15 countries, as you may see on the screen. And all these implementation of the GBEP indicators all over the world have implied a huge amount of work. Next one, please. And now you see only the covers of the many reports that have been implemented in order to measure the GBEP indicators in various countries. So each of the cover that you see on the screen represent a huge amount of activities of measurement of these indicators in the countries. Next one, please. Of course, this also implies a huge level of commitment around the GBEP table in terms of commitment to the GBEP indicators. Well, I have prepared a couple of slides to show you a few lessons learned from the application of the GBEP indicators all over the world. In terms of relevance, for sure, we have determined that the GBEP indicators represent an important tool, a useful tool to inform policymakers about the environmental, social, and economic sustainability of bioenergy at the national level. Of course, this information to policymakers is essential to guide policymaking. And at the same time, this policymaking is also a stimulus to investments and business plans. And it's important in this context to highlight that stability of policies represents a huge stimulus for investments. Next one, please. Other lessons learned in terms of practicality. So in terms of practicality, we have, in terms of data, we have to say that the GBEP indicators are really data intensive. A lot of data are necessary to be collected in order to measure, to duly measure the 24 sustainability indicators. For some of them, only partial data may be available, and this is mainly the case of social indicators for which surveys might be necessary. And some other data are also difficult to be obtained, for example, because of the sensitivity of these data in terms of the private sector, commercial sensitivity of these data. Another additional practicality lessons learned is still connected to data, is connected to the stakeholders to be involved. And we have realized that it is crucial to engage all relevant stakeholders in order to get access to as many data and information as possible to allow the full measurement of the GBEP indicators. And still, in terms of skills, we have realized that the GBEP indicators cover a very broad range of complex environmental, social, and economic issues, with methodologies that sometimes are rather sophisticated, which means that a high level of experience, of expertise, is very much required. And therefore, the team working on the indicators has to imply a high level of skills. In light of all the lessons learned that I've presented so far, we have developed an implementation guide that gives additional information in terms of context, in terms of methodologies, to the experts that would like to measure the GBEP indicators. This implementation guide was launched in January last year. And in addition to this, we are working on a rapid implementation framework, in particular with a web-based tool, in order to facilitate the collection of data by countries. Why this? Because we have realized that many more countries would like to implement the GBEP indicators, many more with respect to the 15 that have implemented the GBEP indicators so far. But this measurement implies a lot of work and therefore a lot of financing resources, and therefore a rapid implementation tool would facilitate a faster measurement of the GBEP indicators in many more countries. Next one, please. Well, it's also true that the GBEP indicators have stimulated also additional application in terms of sustainability assessment, in addition to the simple, let's call it, measurement of the GBEP indicators themselves. And in fact, the GBEP indicators have been used as a reference for a Horizon 2020 project, so funded by the European Commission. It's a 3-year project which is focused on bioenergy sustainability on marginal, underutilized and contaminated lands at the EU level. And also in this context, the GBEP indicators have been a very strong, important sustainability governance reference to create a public web-based interface with a view to inform, give methodologies and provide tools to support development, deployment and investments on bioenergy sustainability. Next one, please. It's important also to highlight that the GBEP indicators could also represent a tool to measure, notify and verify the achievement of the NDCs and also of the INDCs, as well as of the SDGs. And we have many examples around the GBEP table and beyond of countries that have used the GBEP indicators as a tool for measure, notify and verify. Next one, please. Well, if we would like to give ideas of how the GBEP work on sustainability has set for a kind of a policy heritage, well, we've worked in the ECOWAS countries in Africa, northwest of Africa, to support the countries, the ECOWAS region, to develop a regional strategy on bioenergy. We have implemented the GBEP indicators in many countries, and here we have examples on Indonesia, where we have recommended the country to work a lot more on methane capture systems from the palm oil mill effluents, and in fact, they have set the target of 60% of the mills to be equipped with this technology by 2030. We've worked in Vietnam with the GBEP indicators, and as a result, anaerobic digestion was inserted into the intended nationally determined contribution as a method to reduce GHG emissions. In Paraguay, we've measured the GBEP indicators, and just recently, we've also received a further request of the government to measure the GBEP indicators on an additional bioenergy value chain. We worked in the past measuring the GBEP indicators on the bioethanol and on the wood energy sectors. And now we have received the request from the government and actually from the private sector companies working on biodiesel to measure the GBEP indicators also on the biodiesel value chain in order to support the market of this sector. So these are just examples, to mention few of the examples of how the GBEP indicators and the GBEP work have contributed in terms of policy support. Next one, please. So if we have to conclude, of course, we are all in agreement that bioenergy has a role to play. But sustainability is important, is key in order to measure the environmental, social, and economic performances of bioenergy, and therefore sustainability has to be kept high in the agenda of the international discussion, and this is a great opportunity for this conference. Monitoring sustainability is a necessary step, and GBEP has developed one of the most widely recognized set of voluntary sustainability indicators to support policy making and also to set the basis for an international sustainability governance in order, as I said, to contribute to harmonize the sustainability considerations. Next one, please. And this is towards my conclusion. So this is a thank you, and this is a group photo of the first GBEP Bioenergy Week that took place in Brazil in 2013. So it's a kind of greetings back to you in Brazil. Thank you, Renato. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michela. Nice memories over there. So thank you very much, and thank you for explaining this experience with the indicators from GBEP. So I think it has a lot of depth as an instrument to be used in this sustainability governance problem that we want to tackle. Next speaker is Professor Glaucia Souza, the Bioenergy Research Program Coordinator at FAPESP and co-chair of this conference, as co-chair of the BBEST side of the conference, and she'll be here to put forward a lot of academic research that has been devoted to this precise topic and that can still be used at play in our process. Glaucia.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Renato. Good morning, fellow participants of the BBEST-Biofuture conference and panelists of this plenary session that will discuss the way towards a consensus on biomass quantification and sustainability governance. I'm glad to contribute some words on this important topic of enabling and realizing bioenergy's full potential and the role that science is playing in the recommendation of policies and strategies. Well, to get started, I'd like to bring you some good news. A few years ago, we conducted a global assessment of bioenergy sustainability under the aegis of SCOPE, the Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment. The good news is our report has been shortlisted among 2,600 initiatives to compete in the final round of the Global NTREPS Awards. Global NTREPS Awards, also known as the Oscar Awards of Sustainability, organized with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, reward the best practices worldwide, giving birth, promoting, and or implementing any of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as defined by the 1,000 global jurors. We are very proud to be among the finalists, and one outcome is that bioenergy and sustainability is included in a video book NTREPS is preparing on the most sustainable practices in the world. But what was this work? It started with a research network created to define the main challenges for the advancement of bioenergy in the world. Top experts evaluated bioenergy performance against the need to achieve food, climate, and environmental security while providing sustainable development and the potential for innovation. A total of 154 experts from 31 countries and 100 institutions led by BioN collaborated to analyze a series of issues related to the sustainability of bioenergy production and use. This global scientific assessment on bioenergy and sustainability was conducted using the SCOPE rapid assessment process concept, and an international workshop was held at UNESCO headquarters in Paris in December 2013. Next. For the workshop, 14 chapters on various aspects of sustainability. You can go to the next slide, please. 14 chapters on various aspects of sustainability were prepared that served as a basis to produce 4 chapters on cross-cutting issues important for public policies. All chapters have gone through a rigorous peer review process. The synthesis of the volume, totaling 700 pages with 2,000 references as part of the SCOPE series, is available in open access in this ad on the screen. It has had more than 60,000 views, has been used by over 100,000 students, and has been a guide for policy in several sectors. Next. I would like to offer a quote from our study. One approach to solving today's energy challenges is to use modern bioenergy practices to harness the solar energy captured by photosynthesis. Bioenergy derived from plants can play an essential role in satisfying the world's growing energy demand, mitigating climate change, sustainably feeding a growing population, improving socio-economic equity, minimizing ecological disruptions, and preserving biodiversity. There is broad consensus that modern bioenergy will be necessary to achieve a low-carbon future. The idea that the large-scale use of bioenergy compromises efforts to meet these challenges is unsupported by the current scientific evidence when bioenergy practices are implemented properly. Next. And more specifically, that without compromising food security or biodiversity, Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America have an estimated 500 to 900 million hectares of land available for bioenergy. Next. So following the original report, we published policy briefs, the latest one on bioenergy sustainability in Latin America and Africa, with contributions from, and now I want to really acknowledge all these contributions from Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Denmark, Egypt, France, Germany, Ghana, India, Israel, Italy, Japan, Kenya, Malaysia, Mauritius, Mozambique, Norway, Portugal, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, Thailand, the Netherlands, UK, Uruguay, USA, and Zambia. We are very thankful for all the authors of this work, and we'd like to acknowledge your participation in the consequences and the outcomes that it has produced. Next. Okay. So coming back to the topic of our discussion here on biomass production, I want to address now an important point, that is the potential of bioenergy to contribute to sustainable development. Let's have a look on how we are using our land. What I will show is a rough picture. Local context is most important. There is need to properly define with agroecological zoning the development strategy. But I wanted to address the amount of land needed as defined by the scope report, and the numbers don't seem to have grown very much since we looked at it. This is 2016 numbers. First, the total global land is around 13 billion hectares. On the blue panel on the lower left, we have a calculation of all the land used for biofuels production in 2016, including that used for conventional ethanol, diesel, and HVO. Since the land is used also to produce in parallel food products such as sugar, distillers, grain, protein, the estimate is that all the global production of biofuels used 13 million hectares. This is the size of a Nicaragua. If we include all the traditional forms of bioenergy that include the burning of biomass, the range is larger with more uncertainties, but the area is large. It amounts to the area I colored in purple in the middle, corresponding to 10 to 6 million hectares, the area of the UK, Ireland, and Iceland together. The authors of this study estimated that the area needed for bioenergy expansion that would contribute to 25% of the global energy matrix by 2050 is 50 to 200 million hectares. I am coloring this in orange. It is the size of Spain if we look at the lower range. And then what else do we have? All the urban areas of the world amount to around 100 million hectares, the size of Egypt. All the planted forests also to 100 million hectares. In light blue, it's the size of Bolivia. Note that all of these are millions of hectares, not billions. Now, let's look at the larger usage. The crops and arable land correspond to a Russia that is around 1.7 billion hectares. That's what we are using for food production. All the forests are estimated to occupy 3 billion hectares. I'm coloring them in light green. And all the pastures add up to 3.4 billion hectares, the size of a Canada, US, a Mexico, a Peru, a Brazil, and an Argentina combined. I'm coloring them in beige. A lot of this area is inefficiently with extensive pastures and large emissions. We should change that. And we still have all the other land categories that include non-arable mountains and lakes that add up to an Africa and Australia. We could make 100 exajoules using pasture land without deforestation. Next, we estimated that if we use only 1%, I'm talking 1% of pasture land from these 25 countries in Latin America, Caribbean and Africa, we could have an annual GHG emission mitigation of around 50 million tons of CO2 every year. Next. This work that I just mentioned was led by our late friend, Sérgio Trindade, in the launching of our scope report in China, organized by ISAF, and I take the opportunity to invite you to the session on emerging markets that Sérgio would have been chairing. We will have this session this afternoon today. Next. And finally, in 2021, as part of our work on IEA Task 45, we reviewed data on soil carbon stocks related to land use change. This is pasture to sugarcane, and reported on the best land management practices and data that evidences that the payback time of pasture substitution with sugarcane is around 2 to 3 years. As opposed to 8 years if we substitute the cerrados, our savannas, with added benefits that can help recuperate degraded land. We have opportunities here that include the use of different feedstocks, including the energy cane, that is already showing great promise for advanced biofuels production, with over 200 tons per hectare of yield, and that are more tolerant to drought and diseases. I also invite you to attend the roundtable on energy cane in this conference. Next. In summary, there is enough land with current feedstocks and residues. What Scope Bioenergy and Sustainability scientific assessment finds is not only the path to sustainable biofuels, but improving energy security for over 1.3 billion people with no access to electricity, lifting rural areas out of poverty in developing regions, making it possible to move away from fossil fuels, and ultimately securing a sustainable and equitable future below 2 degrees of global temperatures increase. The resources and technologies for the transition from fossil to renewable energy are within our reach, but achieving the critical contributions needed from modern bioenergy call for political and individual will, continued monitoring, and most importantly, capacity building to make bioenergy cost competitive in emerging markets. That's what I had to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Glauser, for this. I believe many of those highlights that you brought us are a great start to and a good, more detailed point on the scales that I showed in my little squares when you showed the world map and the kinds of land available. They are already an answer to this, and thank you for presenting the scope's conclusions. This is where I would introduce Marian Ali from the Packard Foundation. She's the Climate and Program Officer responsible for the bioenergy strategy in the Packard Foundation, which is an organization that ties into many NGOs, conservation programs, and that takes a quite skeptical attitude or cautious attitude regarding bioenergy and sustainability. So she would be able to make a good point on how to build convergence from different departing standpoints. She sent her excuses, but will be available to engage in this process going forward. So I'm now happy to introduce Professor Keith Klein, that can make a good follow-up to Professor Glaus's presentation on his views and the findings throughout his work on land management and how much bioenergy could we get, how much could be available, and but especially using what practices. Professor from the Oak Ridge National Lab.
Thank you. Thank you, Renato. It's really an honor to be here. I think we can, yes, go to the first slide, and I assume you can hear me. So I decided to title this presentation, "The Foundational Role for Biomass in a Sustainable Circular Economy." Foundational or fundamental or critical role. That topic has been, I think, stressed repeatedly this morning in the plenary and by prior speakers. And I do think this new study from IEA on renewables and the role of bioenergy for our decarbonization by 2050 net zero is really important. I do want to acknowledge my sponsors at the Department of Energy and the Bioenergy Technologies Office, and that I'm fortunate enough to have several grandchildren, which I always dedicate these talks to. Thank you. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I have been also invited and have spent a lot of time on several committees and technical panels to draft standards for how we define a circular economy and how we measure and assess performance of circular economy. Jerry, who spoke previously, mentioned the importance of building business confidence in investments, and that's one of the basic roles of a standard. Is with clear, practical standards, we can measure and verify, and you can have exchange and know what you're buying and selling. And so, the role of standards is really to help enhance business confidence and investment. And when we look at all the different initiatives, several are underway today, to promote a circular economy, they all try to minimize and hopefully eventually get to almost zero extraction of non-renewable resources and drive our economy on renewable resources. And biomass necessarily is the foundation for that. And it's a key component for all these efforts. And therefore, the issue of how we define and verify and standardize sustainably sourced biomass has become an issue in these standards as well. I've spent the most time on two different standards that are in development with the International Organization for Standardization. I was also on a standard technical panel for United Laboratories circular performance measures for businesses. And in both cases, we've been dealing a lot with definitions of sustainable biomass. And we could discuss that more if people are interested. But for the ISO initiatives, we are developing framework, principles, definitions, and indicators to measure and assess circular economy performance. And it's quite a major undertaking involving more than 80 different organizations all over the world. And Brazil is playing a leading role, by the way, on some of these committees. The definition that is currently, and it's draft and not yet past a first ballot, but it's been worked on for about a year, this definition, for a circular economy, stresses a circular flow of resources that regenerates, retains, or adds to resource value while contributing to sustainable development. And a couple of key things there that I wanted to stress are both the sustainable development aspect, which includes social. It's more than just greenhouse gas emissions, as I like to say, and the regenerating of the resources. Thank you. Next slide. So, despite the important role for biomass and bioenergy that has been identified, and actually this slide is pointing out some recent publications that have been sponsored by IEA Bioenergy that I think provide some very good information on how biomass and bioenergy supply chains, specific supply chains, many of them in operation, I think over 25 supply chains that are operational and had measurable effects on established indicators for SDGs, such as these listed on this slide, showing benefits. And these are, of course, case studies that were selected as exemplary. There are, as has been mentioned, concerns and precautions that must be taken with developing bioenergy. But there's a lot of opportunity, and it's documented, and we have data, and yet we still have this resistance. And I've been thinking a lot about how to try to overcome that resistance, and so have the colleagues on this panel. So I'm looking forward to this discussion and moving forward. But one of the things that I've observed, and that I think Glaucia before me mentioned in some ways, and the scope study definitely mentions it, is that by establishing sustainability requirements for biomass related to energy, which has kind of come first, I think, in the process, we've had an influence on practices in managing wider sectors related to forestry and agriculture. And that influence has been positive and beneficial. And it can be measured. And there are effects that are beneficial, both economic and environmental, social and environmental, that I think we need to look at more carefully as we provide for natural climate solutions. Or I think my friend Paolo from IE Bioenergy also spoke about natural climate benefits of managing our resources. Next slide, please. I should mention that there are references available with this presentation that will be posted when the presentations are posted, both several that are cited in these slides as well as others of interest. Now, Glaucia mentioned biomass quantification, and a lot of that has been done necessarily by using models. And models, by definition, simplify things and put things into boxes and categories. However, biomass is really integral to almost all activities on the planet, and what we really need to think about, I think, more is how we integrate biomass with other ecosystem services and have integrated management plans that provide multiple services with biomass as one of the co-products. I just drove from Virginia, where I was helping take care of grandchildren, to Tennessee, and along the way counted over 15 large piles, bulldozer piles of forest material piled up to be burned. A couple had already been burned and were smoldering. And these were just along the road, and these are common in Southeast United States and many parts of the world because there are not markets for biomass. And the alternative fate of biomass is what defines often how we quantify and model these things. And that is one of the real tricky parts in assessing sustainability. But there are several factors that impact productivity and our measurement of quantification of biomass. Some of those we cannot control, like weather and how much land there is on the planet. But we can control resource management and our investments and the policy framework that drives investments and research and development. And I think that that's where governance comes in. And Inge Stupak will speak after me, stressing some of the important roles for governance in guiding resource management and investments. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. So to build confidence in the role of biomass and sustainable, climate smart, circular economies, I think there are some things we've learned. We've have experience. We've been working on this for a while. A paper that I cite here by Kiski al. Is trying to assemble best practices for engaging communities in developing land management plans, resource management plans, that is very applicable to biomass. But the key point, the first point, is we must engage the public in the process and build more in the science. And I think that we have a little discussion going on in the Q&A, which is very good. Our friend Uwe Frisch has noted that we need to listen to people's concerns and really think about them and how we can address them. And I think we need a constructive way to engage the public in that process. We also need to be able to communicate the distinctions among the different options and the levels of confidence in the data and findings. Science is a process, and provide information that's reliable and timely, especially for effects of activities and investment options that are of high priority to local stakeholders. And that tends to be things like jobs and air quality and the noise in their backyard. So I do look forward to discussing this question of how can we reach global consensus on verifiable standards for sustainably sourced biomass. I've got some definitions of sustainably sourced biomass that are being used right now in draft standards, and I think that it is possible to develop consensus on some practical ways to measure that, but it's not going to be easy. I, for one, am willing to work on it and look forward to the rest of this panel discussion. Next slide is just to say thank you and show one of my other grandchildren on a camping trip, and that's it for my presentation. Again, an honor to be.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you so much for this presentation and for the lovely images of your grandkids as well. So you've touched already on the bridge. So governance is something that is very important going on. So we have talked about the problem, the quantification possibilities, what evidence is already there, instruments that are available, such as the GBAP indicators. But how more broadly can we ensure a governance process that can be trusted? So this is the topic of our next speaker. Just before I passing the floor to Professor Inge Stupak, who recently published an excellent paper on the subject, I want to make two brief announcements here. The first is that the presentations for the session are already uploaded in the conference page in your Whova platform. So at the very bottom of the page, you can already download the PDF versions of the presentations today. And the second announcement is that please move to the Q&A session also in the Whova and put questions there you want for specific speakers or to the panel as a whole. We look forward to this in the Q&A part of our panel. So now with that announcement, Professor Inge, we are all ears.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for inviting me to talk about this topic together with all these interesting speakers. So if I could get the first slide here. As Renato said, it's based on a paper that I wrote together with colleagues from the University of Toronto, Maha Mansour and Ted Smith. But I should also acknowledge colleagues from the EIA Bioenergy for many interesting discussions in the last years, among other, Keith Klein. So next slide, please. So the contents of this talk will be something about the context, meaning the policy science stakeholder interface, something about situations where governance has a role to play, and also something about where it is maybe less useful. And in the situations where it is useful, how do we design legitimate governance systems that can help to increase stakeholder trust in sustainability of the operations? And I will highlight four topics under this topic of design. One thing is legitimacy principles, good governance principles, and adaptive management governance frameworks, and multi-level governance. And finally, I'll try to give my own suggestions for what novel tools within governance systems that we might find useful and what is maybe underused today. Next slide, please. So across the literature that we reviewed from the paper that Renato mentioned was that trustful relationships are absolutely critical to achieve a social license to operate. And in this case, it means increase the use of sustainable biomass for energy and the bioeconomy. So we've divided stakeholders, you could say here, in three groups: policy, science, and other stakeholders. We've already talked about the importance of policy being science-based, or at least science-informed. But the part about trust is much about the broader group of stakeholders. They need to trust that the policy and the governance systems are appropriate in every sense. So that means the design and also in the implementation and enforcement. And they also need to trust the science, meaning that it's credible. Next slide, please. So speaking of where governance is useful and where it is maybe less useful, we created this matrix, a 2x2 matrix. Where we have high and low levels of trust and high and low levels of suspiciousness. And governance is most useful in where you have high levels of trust and high levels of suspiciousness together, even if that might sound a bit contradictory. But trust in that situation is achieved by documentation. So it means that there is basic trust that systems are appropriate, and by providing the evidence that about the impacts, trust can be maintained and achieved. If you have low levels of suspiciousness, you also have a social license to operate, and the trust is then achieved by shared values, meaning that the incentive to monitor and document is less. You will simply trust people that they operate according to your values in that case. So something like risk-based approaches might be more acceptable in such a situation where there's more trust available. So you might change, or you might decrease the costs for the governance if you have more trust. On the other hand, if you have a situation with high levels of suspiciousness and low levels of trust, monitoring, science, and control will be disbelieved, so they are not useful anymore. Harmful motives might be assumed, and trust is rather achieved by beliefs or ideology or emotions. So that's a situation where governance is not so useful, and you need to increase that to get into the orange box here, you could say. And there are two situations where people are more prone to manipulation, and that is this high level of suspiciousness, low level of trust, and the opposite, and in both cases you don't have the evidence. It is of less importance in those cases. Okay, next slide, please. So in those situations where governance is useful, we should pay attention to legitimacy, and as I said before, good governance principles, adaptive governance, and differences in scale. So if we talk about legitimacy, it's useful to separate between three types of legitimacy and pay attention to all of them in designing the governance system. The first is the input legitimacy, which could be defined as gaining the approval of actors through their satisfaction with their participation and involvement in the system. For output legitimacy, it's their satisfaction with the success of the governance system in achieving what it attempts to achieve. And for throughput legitimacy, it's about the satisfaction with the level of efficiency, fairness, partiality, transparency, and so on and so forth with the implementation and enforcement systems. So that's where the good governance principles play in. So capturing it in short, you could say it's about high quality participation to make effective progress towards sustainability goals in a resource efficient and fair manner. Next slide, please. So this diagram is one that we put together based on this literature review, and you will recognize the three input legitimacy principles here. And the gray boxes around the diagram, you find these good governance principles that has been applied, among other, for the World Bank by their work and defined by them since the 70s. So they include impartiality, truthfulness, representation, accountability, responsiveness, impact, effectiveness, efficiency, fairness, and transparency. So these concepts are repeatedly being used in the literature that tries to assess if governance systems are appropriate, and under the term good governance. The last element here is the adaptive part, which is useful when predict and act tools are not working very well, and that is often in situations with lots of uncertainty, more complex situations. So instead of making decisions in the dark, this is not a perfect tool, but it may help still. And it has different phases. So the planning phase, the first one here, is about putting the governance system in place and ensuring that all the good governance principles are observed together with these three legitimacy principles: input, output, and throughput legitimacy. And the next phase is the do phase, so implementing and enforcing the systems. And here, a very central or key element is the monitoring and evaluation system that should help document that the system has the impact that it is designed to have. But you can also monitor stakeholder satisfaction, for example, or if the resource use is efficient. So again, addressing also in the monitoring all three legitimacy aspects. The last phase is evaluate and learn, where you analyze the monitoring data and assess if the system is working as it is intended to work, and otherwise give recommendations for how it can be changed. And then the new cycle starts with the standards and the whole process, with stakeholder inputs being repeated and the standards are being revised. And this there are systems that already work more or less like this. For example, for certification systems, where standards are being revised every 5th year, but it could be applied more broadly in other systems as well. Next slide, please. So the last aspect, which was not included in this model that I showed you before, which is otherwise a kind of a checklist, you could say, when you design a governance system, but this issue with scale was not included. Keith was already mentioning it, that the needs for a governance to be legitimate might be different. It might differ depending on the scale. In global supply chains, you have the end users in one end that define what they see and perceive as sustainable, and in the other end you might have local producers that should also have an input to the process to be able to perceive it as a legitimate process. And you could say that the end users would like to see all products meeting the same sustainability requirements that they have put in place. But if local standards are also being made, that might be difficult. There might be many different standards that should fit into these global unified standards. So that's a challenge, and it has been identified as a group led by McDermott et al. As one of the greatest challenges to forest management to solve this conundrum. And I think we can broaden this up to be also about other about agricultural systems and bioenergy as well. Next slide, please. So if I should suggest based on this review, what tools could maybe be put in place to improve legitimacy of the existing systems and thereby also increasing trust, is pay more attention to these adaptive features of the governance systems, make all stakeholders aware of these processes and how they are being run and when they are able to give an input. Toolbox 2 here, systems for correcting the systems and criteria for good governance are not being followed, or input, output, and throughput legitimacy principles, and identify where the problem is. Next, also the bridge between science and policy. Even if there's a lot of good work being done, I'm still hearing that there is research tends quite specific, where policy needs more broader results, and making those two things meet is also a challenge, where new tools are needed, or they need to be applied more for those that are already there. Then high quality information. We need systems, we need to agree upon the processes on how to create knowledge that is useful for governance, and avoid cherry picking, for example. So one of such tools is systematic review, which is a process that is more formalized and has been put in place to address this problem. Next, communication platforms where the stakeholders can speak together, and like the BioFutures platform here, and for mutual learning. And finally, also new tools that can go across scales and solve this conundrum between the need for flexible and localized input and global, more standardized and unified criteria. This was what I had to say. Thank you very much. And then last slide here, you have some references if you want to dig more into these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Inge. So if this isn't a very thoughtful process, thinking on what it takes to build a governance process that works, I don't know what it is. So it isn't easy, and I count on you and the others behind this to help us build this process going forward. So we have had our initial presentations, and just before I move into the moderated debate section of our panel, I think lots of issues have arisen that we can try to go a bit more in depth. Another announcement that I have, so there is also a poll being open in the Hoover system about this conference, specifically looking at the very thorny issue of land use change. So it would also be interesting to get your views on that from the audience, and I can talk about the results at the end of the session. So before I get to the questions from the audience, I'd like to promote some bit of debate now that we have heard the perspectives of all here. Back when so let me start to provoke this debate, and please raise your hands or manifest yourselves in our own speakers only chat system if you wish to speak. But back when I talked about breaking down a complex process in parts, we have discussed here this matter of scale. Do you believe that any discussion about biomass sustainability, governance, and quantification should start somewhere? And would the best place to start be this matter of quantification and the assumptions behind it, so that if we have a notion of just how many biomass in which lands are we looking forward to develop, and this would be a starting point already hard enough to get at to achieve consensus around these potentials, and then moving from there until what are the specific policies and governance mechanisms and incentives we need to have to realize what we have assessed. So who would like to speak on this? I think Klaus and Keith have already spoken about quantification, but really anyone wanting to come forward.
Okay, no one else. So thank you, Renato. The land use and land use change issues that I was looking to see where the poll is, are obviously hot topics. And I find that the global models can produce any result you want, really, depending on some assumptions. So I think it's better to look at the opportunities to improve land management in specific situations and the amount of biomass that could be taken advantage of through better management. And some people call it waste and residues. Some people call it, pre-commercial thinning for forestry, or we have so many crops that go wasted and left on the fields when the market prices fall. There's so many different sources of biomass. The increasing number of hurricanes and extreme weather events have caused massive buildup of biomass that has to be disposed of. And I think if we could start by getting systems in place that create markets that can use all the biomass that right now is often being burned to get rid of it, or becomes a source of fuel for devastating wildfires, that would be a good place to start. Because I think we can continue the debate looking at global numbers for a long time. So another approach that I would like to promote is for individual regions, states, and countries to really look at their resources. And again, resource management, integrated land use management plans, and think about how they could increase productivity and have some biomass, and what their opportunities are for being more self-sufficient and more inclusive in terms of rural development and engaging stakeholders that maybe haven't always been engaged in energy development initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Inge?
Yes, yes. I would like to say that I'm thinking that probably there is a disconnect both for quantification and for governance between these global level work and the more local work. So if you have these global assessments of the biomass that's available at a global scale, I don't know, remember who said it, that when you model, I think it was Keith, when you model, you simplify, and that means that it will inevitably be incorrect in many cases. So you need both approaches. You also need to look at the local scale to see what's available. And there was actually another project in the EIA Bioenergy that was about mobilization, and this was one of the main conclusions from that project, that you cannot just take these global level estimates. You also need to verify these at a local level. And governance, if you put in place international criteria, they need to be high level, more general, and then you need to specify them at local levels and leave it for local levels to make them operational. And I think that we need tools and processes to make those things come together for both quantification and for governance. There are initiatives where it's done, but it's not as pervasive as it could be. And also for people to meet each other. These people actually doing both the quantification at global scales and local scales, they need to meet each other and not just sit in each their camp to do it. And the same thing with the governance also.
Thank you. This is very interesting. So I also wonder whether within this disconnect between the global modeling and the local assessment, there are some opportunities that are very small improvements, but maybe there are others where there can be very large improvements depending on the practices that you adjust. No, or some things that are not being considered in the global models, that once you have this capacity, you can design policies to bring it about. But Jerry, you wish also to comment on this?
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Keith and Inga said, and make sort of a semi-glib suggestion. So in the Paris Agreement, they were able to achieve success on the Paris Agreement because of switching from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach, whereby countries suggested their contribution. What if we had a nationally determined contribution to the bioeconomy? So let countries work out what their contribution of biomass would be. And as an example of that, we could look at the US billion-ton study, which incorporated a very important point, which Keith has made well a few times, the idea of if there is a market and there's a value for the biomass, then we won't just burn it in slash piles or we won't let it rot in the field. We'll create an incentive and to properly use and sustainably use that biomass while, of course, taking into account soil organic carbon, etc. But something for the Biofuture Platform Initiative to consider would be recruiting a nationally determined contribution to the global bio and waste-based carbon budget.
Well, that is quite a provocative suggestion, and I would say that if perhaps there is global guidance or a set of standards and criteria for this national submission of biomass quantification, then we could be approaching this connection or the best of both worlds that we have been seeking. Michela, you're next. I saw your hand
Thank
raised.
you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So yes, well, the interventions from Keith and Inge and Jerry, of course, created also a lot of further considerations. The first one is that I would not suggest to start from the biomass quantification as a first step, as a driver. My suggestion would be to do a sustainability assessment as a first step. Why I'm saying this? Because as soon as you do a sustainability assessment at what is the current situation, as Kate was saying, I mean, the current management, how you currently manage the bioenergy production in this case, then you do an assessment of what is in stock. And this gives you a status quo, I mean, the current situation. At the same time, this could give to policymakers an idea of where the sustainability has to be improved, where it has to be, I mean, intervention is needed in order to, for example, eliminate some barriers, commercial barriers, for example. And this is the kind of role that the GBEP indicators could play. Once you have an idea of the barriers that you have in a certain country, in a certain bioenergy value chain, then you could do a kind of a feasibility study to know how to intervene to eliminate barriers and how to get out the best from the potentials of the bioenergy production in a specific context. It's a kind of hand-in-hand initiatives, activities. On one side, as Jerry was saying, top-down, bottom-up approach has to go hand-in-hand somehow. And the second consideration is related to NDCs and INDCs. Well, actually, we as GBEP, but also in the context of FAO, we are receiving a lot of requests from government representatives where bioenergy objectives, specific bioenergy objectives, have been inserted into their national NDCs or INDCs, and they would like to receive some support in order to measure the achievement of these objectives that they have included in their own NDCs. And in this case, we are proposing the GBEP indicators as a tool to measure the achievement of their NDCs objectives, and at the same time give some additional recommendation to the governments in order to see what's missing. So what has to be put in place in order to further improve the performance of the bioenergy sector.
So thank you, Michela, for that perspective. So the assessment of sustainability now, the status quo, can also be useful to identify how to go further in this local part of the exercise. You want to go back? Oh, this is a hot debate. So okay, please be brief. So we have still other aspects to discuss. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to make it fast. I just saw this morning that the paper came out from the University of Georgia about what are the barriers to mobilization of biomass in that region, and it showed up to be more economic issues than actually sustainability issues, and actually just getting the biomass out of the area and to the places where the production takes place. And this issue with participation of smaller producers, small landowners, it is something that they have addressed in the Baltic states. They have created an online platform called Bulk Pool that allows many different small users just to immediately participate in the market. And the World Bioenergy Association has just had a presentation about Lithuania as a success story, where there is a presentation of Bulk Pool, and I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't know if there's something like that in the US as well, but I thought this sounded like an interesting tool to as a way to remove that barrier that relates to small users and their participation in the markets. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for that. Keith, you want to compliment?
I just wanted to support Michaela in stressing that rather than trying to reach agreement on a global number for the quantity available, focusing in on the sustainability concerns and building that local supply base, working with what I call local champions and local communities, it is a more productive approach, because and I'm trying to respond to a question over here in the side chat that I saw a paper I saw the paper Inge mentioned, but I also saw a paper this morning about GHG emissions from southeast forests used for bioenergy are going to be more than 40 years to reach parity, and that's all based on their reference scenario assumptions and what would happen in the absence of using the wood for bioenergy to that landscape. And those assumptions, it's anyone's guess, so anyone can put anything they want there, and they do. So you can get any answer you want. If you assume there's going to be a wildfire in the absence of harvesting for biomass, you get an immediate benefit from using biomass for bioenergy. If you assume it's going to be a luscious, productive forest growing without any disturbance whatsoever, no harvesting, and by the way, it's all private land, and if they're not getting paid for products, they're probably going to cut it down and change it to urban development. But if you ignore that and just assume it's going to grow forever, then you get a totally different answer. And we can't win that debate because it's all our best guesstimate of what's going to happen in the future in the absence of bioenergy option. But when you deal with communities and local stakeholders, they realize they have, it's not just greenhouse gas emissions, it's jobs, it's income, it's development, and they don't want certain types of development, but you can work with them and help them achieve their goals. And bioenergy can be one part of that, not the only solution, but one part of that. Thank you. But I want to support Michaela.
That's a good word on the risks of integrated assessment modeling and accounting for this. So it is a position to base policy on that. Professor Glaucia, so.
Yes, so I want to tip in with the recent development here in Brazil, which is an opportunity for bioenergy expansion. We have a policy, a new legislation in peace that will phase out the landfills. We have to find uses for waste, residues, urban residues, industrial residues. We have to end the landfills, and the state of São Paulo government is looking for solutions for this, and bioenergy is getting ready to contribute with biogas production. So this has become a new field in expansion here. I know in Europe you have a lot of biogas production. In Brazil we have a lot of potential potential, and there has been the mapping of all the potential sites for good, efficient biogas production initiatives. So this is a way of joining policy that might help leverage the development of these new bioenergy initiatives that I wanted to show, to mention.
Thank you, Klaus. And you moved to my next little topic here that Inge also mentioned, and Michela, that the barriers are many times economic. And you mentioned policies. I believe that policies are a way, in one hand, to enforce the outcomes that we want, instead of just assuming them for the future, but also to provide this tie-in with sustainability and economic barriers. So in Brazil, we have implemented that's 1 year in completion, already completed and working, the RenovaBio policy rewards the producers instead of just controlling sustainability, but rewards the producers of biofuels with their environmental services in relation to what they have produced, the biofuels, but they have to be certified against a number of criteria and prerequisites. For instance, the area that they are using should not come from recent deforestation, and other prerequisites that ensure that those producers that are voluntarily engaged in RenovaBio are among the most sustainable producers that we have in the country. To what extent do you think that these sustainability outcomes in governance would need to be tied to policies and incentives as well, instead of just being used as controls and limitations?
Well, I definitely favor policy incentives.
Okay, Michela, you also raised your hand, and Jerry?
Thank you very much. Well, the first consideration is to sustainability. So it's essential to be extremely clear in saying that sustainability could only be achieved if equal importance is given to the 3 pillars of sustainable development. And this is sometimes given for granted, but it's not so obvious. So it's very important to clarify this. So environmental, social, because there are a lot of benefits in terms of social aspects that we don't have to forget, and the economic aspects, of course. That was the first one. And then the second consideration is, well, I would see policies guiding the application, the implementation. So policies setting the basis of how the development is in place in the country, policies and policymakers trying to improve the policies themselves in order to further adjust where needed, in order to further improve the performances, environmental, social, and economic performances of the bioenergy production, and policies also guiding investments. So I would not see the way around. So investments guiding policies, but it's the contrary. And at the middle ground, they meet each other, as we said before, hand in hand. And of course, they have to give input one to the other in order to further adjust the policy on one side and the opportunities on the other side in order to further develop the opportunities of bioenergy. Thank you.
Thank you, Michela. So I believe also the answer is yes. Jerry?
Yeah, I think that the idea that we're getting at is sort of valorization for not just ecosystem services, but for sustainability services. And we could look at a good example of that, which is the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which does not necessarily valorize across the three pillars. But I would say one of the things that we've learned from the California approach, and that hopefully we will also see from the Hanova Bio approach, which is that if one takes a more agnostic view towards policy incentives, one gets better outcomes. I think something that has hindered the growth of the bioeconomy is that a lot of policies, whether from the US or the EU, have been quite prescriptive. They've set up and rewarded certain pathways that were set up quite defensively. And what we've seen is that if we complement that with a technology agnostic approach that specifically awards carbon intensity, the market has responded. And likewise, if there was a way to incentivize or reward in the market additional sustainability aspects, then I think, again, you would see not in the first year, not in the third year, but years 5, 6, 7, 8, facilities being built, investments being made that take into account that incentive structure, like we're seeing sort of belatedly in the California instance, where now, 13 years after Arnold Schwarzenegger asked for more engagement on decarbonizing transport in California, now we have a handful of new biorefineries going in that are really driving the carbon intensity of the fuel system down. And I think that example of sort of setting in the enabling environment, being approach agnostic, but providing sufficient rewards is a very powerful combo. Thanks.
Thanks, Jared. Probably Schwarzenegger knew it because he came from the future. And sorry about the joke. I'm passing on to Inge.
There is that. And he did not choose to terminate the bioeconomy.
Inge, why don't you comment this? If you can also address a related question by Jim Macmillan from the IA Bioenergy Network that put in the question in the Q&A. In this tie-in of policies, he also asks what policies precedent exist to promote regenerative agricultural practices that build soil carbon. So this is one example specific of what we are saying in general. So soil carbon is a huge factor in all those calculations of LCA. So if you please address the specific as well as the general, if you can.
Yes, I can maybe start out then with the soil carbon. There could be incentives to. We know what the ecosystem mechanisms that will increase the soil carbon. It's typically reweighting of soils, but you will lose if you have living biomass on the land. You might lose some of that. So where the trade-off is between those two is also maybe something that needs to be examined from a scientific point of view. But otherwise, you can put incentives in place for reweighting. And of course, setting aside lands where you don't remove as much biomass, but it's a very long process. So it's probably not a result that we're going to see within the next decades. So I am not the ultimate expert on this, but even reweighting is also going to take time. But these are the tools. But you have to be patient with soil carbon, I would say. And for just getting back to the issue of bioenergy, I was thinking that maybe we also need to have a more open discussion about the role of bioenergy in the energy system in different places. In Denmark, we have had incentives, economic incentives, and still have to use biomass, and it has been accepted from biomass from carbon dioxide taxes. But there were actually political decisions that were trying to put carbon taxes on biomass because the coal has now been largely phased out of the energy system, and they want to switch to solar and wind and heat pumps and other technologies. So probably that discussion about what role does the biomass have in the energy system is also very important. And it will vary hugely among sites, I would say.
That's good. Thank you. Jerry, want to come in again because we have our time is short and we need to move on.
I just want to make a point that I think that Denmark and Norway are outstanding examples of policy, but people are taking the wrong lessons. The lesson to take from Denmark and Norway is to use, and actually Brazil, sorry, in deference to Minister Albuquerque, you use the resources that you have, right? Instead, people are taking the message, oh, electrification is going to take care of everything. That's not the message. That's really not what the message should be. And so if Denmark, which has done extremely well with offshore wind, because, and it's barely offshore, sorry, but the Baltic is a puddle, and they've done extremely well with their wind resources. If they can get to a point where they can drive electrofuels and all that stuff, perfect. That is their resource base. But that doesn't mean that everybody needs to do it the Danish way.
Yeah, that's right. I will move here, and perhaps you can address this also in your other comments, because I'd like to discuss the issue of uses. I think this is very key. I think Keith and Inge touched upon it already in their presentations. When you assess biomass and the projects and the forestry and the agriculture and the livestock, one thing that is perhaps a trend for the past was, let's examine bioenergy sustainability, or bioenergy specifically, what are they doing? So, but what about how you're managing the forest for every use, or agriculture for every use, the pastures, water, soil, organic carbon? How is the outcome of your production across all the products? So to what extent do you believe that this problem should not be solved by looking just at bioenergy? And in which approaches, which angles, which cases we should indeed separate the specific use that we are talking about? So is there also, how much is there room for that? Michela.
Yeah, thank you very much, Renato. This is a very good point. And we have addressed this issue throughout the years during which in GBEP we've been working on the GBEP indicators. Why I'm saying this? Because of course, while measuring the GBEP indicators, we look at the portion of the production which is then dedicated to bioenergy. But to get to that point, we have to look at the whole value chain. And so it means agricultural production, forestry management for wood energy, for example, rather than agricultural production when it comes to other feedstocks. So indeed, in writing, let's say, we say that it's related to bioenergy, but the sustainability assessment of the bioenergy value chain implies a huge amount of studies that are very agricultural and forestry related assessments. Absolutely, yes.
Go ahead, Keith, you and then Klaus, yeah? I think Inge also wants to speak.
I know our time is getting short, and I do want to get to the question of next topic. I did want to suggest that it's really important to look at how we manage the land and what the options are for the people who have rights and traditional access, and that is very site specific, and it depends on the country. And I could give many cases, but there was an example in Guatemala. Maya Bio Reserve was kind of the last large forest in Central America, and the German colleagues that I worked with that were funded by GTZ were talking about the striptease of the Petén, which was the northern state of Guatemala, as it was losing all its clearing and logging that was not managed sustainably. And following Inge's example of multiple levels of governance, local communities were actually given rights and responsibilities to manage those forests, the last remaining forest, much of it in a multiple use zone, 800,000 hectares, 800,000 hectares of public land for community management in northern Guatemala, and they are preserving it better than some of the national parks. And it's engaging those local communities was more of a social challenge than a technical challenge, I should say, because we brought in a lot of technical assistance on forestry management and all this kind of stuff, but it was social relationships in communities and business skills and things like that that became critical. Anyway, there are other examples in the United States where traditional timber management for paper mills, the paper mills have closed, and now these forests are going to become golf courses and urban development kind of landscapes. And a lot of people don't want that, but they don't have an option. And bioenergy is not the solution, but working with communities, bioenergy can be one small part of a land management solution for that community. And I think we have to get to each place and look at their opportunities and again, have that multiple level of governance that kind of defines what's possible is really important. Thank you.
Very good. Glaucia, your word.
Yes. Okay, so I want to mention a study we are doing. Actually, we are developing a methodology to define not only how much biomass we have, but how efficiently we are using it. We are integrating a techno-economic analysis with life cycle analysis and with exergy analysis. This is something that we are trying to use to quantify sustainability. Exergy is this concept where you measure the amount of wasted energy in your process. You have to gather the whole cycle, everything is considered and integrated. This is work that we are doing in the task 39 under the task 39 activities, and we are comparing Guatemala, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil right now with some great findings. We are finding exactly what are the streams that need improvement so you can reach increased sustainability with recommendations that are based on the process itself and on real world data. We are modeling out estimates. We are gathering data. So this is, I think, something that I want to stress: the need to have access to data in emerging markets, in Africa, in Latin America. It is something that has been difficult. We are making progress, but I think the next couple of years we're going to have lots of methods to really contribute with the discussion with actual numbers. Move, I think, into an easier dialogue because we know what should be done to improve.
That's good. Thank you, Glaucia. So yes, this is very important, as we need here in our process that we are starting today on sustainability governance to build this map on what is needed. And another thing is also to actually implement it, and this goes much beyond the BioFuture platform or our organizations. It's for the local governments and all, but we need to have a converging view on the roadmap. And speaking about converging view, we unfortunately had lots more topics to discuss. I thought on discussing land use change, how can you preempt or adapt instead of preempting everything, and other aspects, but time is short. I'm taking some of the several questions from the audience went in the same direction. I'll take them to pose them back to you, and also for you to add your general comments and final comments on this. So, and they are all geared at how to engage those who are skeptical of biomass? What are the strategies to let the general public know about the sustainability of biomass? How can we, from Luciana Ferreira also, what can still be done to build trust in science in this matter? And so all of this, these general questions of putting trust in the science, in the process, engaging with skepticals, and also about how you view yourselves and your organizations in this process, along with the BioFuture platform, going on the next 2-3 years, to working together and try to tackle this challenge. I'm going in the order that you started here, so Jerry, you go first.
I think there was a lot of facets to that question. I'll focus my remarks on where we envision the BioFuture campaign contributing in a positive way. So the BioFuture campaign seeks to recruit industry members and to really showcase how they are going to help substitute for fossil fuels. And so, like, we're talking about what are the plants that they're building, what are their visions for decarbonization, exactly nuts and bolts how they are going to make those substitutions happen. And those substitutions, as we will point out, are fundamental to achieving this broader net zero ambition. And so I think that if we take that very concrete approach, that very practical approach, that at every step has the proper clarity and the proper voice on the issue of sustainability, that over time we will move forward. And I'll just finish, sorry, this is a little long. I'll just finish by saying that most individuals do not, even very literate, engaged individuals, do not go to the primary sources of information. And maybe Inga will prove me wrong, but I think most people actually look to brands that they trust. So if people see brands that they trust, whether an airline or a coffee shop or a fashion clothes that they wear, then they will follow their lead and they will assume that those brands have done their homework. So what we need to do is we need to meet them where they are in We Mean Business, in the net zero campaigns. And I'll stop there. And thank you again for the chance to contribute.
Thank you very much. Michela, how we do this going forward?
Thank you, Renato. Well, I have to say that in the last 15 years that GBAP has been working, a lot has changed also in terms of public perception about bioenergy. And this is also a kind of a success in light of the many efforts that were done in the context of the Global Bioenergy Partnership, for example, in joining forces with other initiatives. And I would say that information is always the key, in the sense that giving the right scientific-based information, sharing good practices, sharing good examples that could be replicated somewhere else, this is the key in order to somehow, I wouldn't say convince, the public knowledge about bioenergy, but have them thinking differently and openly about bioenergy. So that's my suggestion. And of course, joining forces is as key as it is the information. And so this is also to say that we are pleased to continue joining forces with the BioFuture platform and our colleagues all in this panel for future works together on bioenergy. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michela. Thank you for those words. Professor Glaucia.
Yes, this is a very difficult question. To build trust in science is it's larger than bioenergy. We have to, I think, understand that a lot of the problems that bioenergy faces are related to agriculture, are related to long-standing practices that in general are also not sufficiently sustainable. So we have to build trust, I think, of the public that what we are eating is done is okay, that how we are producing is okay, that how we use our water is okay. So there is a lot of things that producing biomass, that using forest resources, that using ecosystem resources demand. And I think we are in a crisis, in a planetary scale crisis, that science is trying to produce solutions in small, in very little time, and as much as we can, I think on the scientific side, we have to build the bridges. So at SP, for instance, we have a policy program that is being remodeled to address the need to inform policymakers with science-based evidence. So this is something that's going to come up soon. And it has been used successfully for bioenergy before to produce, for instance, the Boeing gap analysis on aviation biofuels. The Brazilian contribution to that report was using this program at FAPESP for policy, informing policy and strategies for policy. So I think we are working on it, but it is a big challenge for scientists at this moment. There is a lot of incredulity in the science contributions, and we have to keep working at it.
Thank you, Glaucia. So indeed, this is crucial. Keith?
Yeah, I agree with the speakers, and I agree that we still have as my grandfather said, a long row to hoe, which means there's still a lot of work to do. I think that we do need to approach it as there's a question about integrated landscape kind of an approach. I think that is important. I think we have to think about landscapes and how we fit in the landscape. I think we do have to engage stakeholders constructively, and I think that is difficult when we speak in generalities and works better when we have a very specific case and option, and people need to be informed of what their options are and what the effects are expected to be of the different options. The sustainability issue has been mentioned several times. I'm reminded of a Supreme Court decision on pornography. Sustainability is kind of like pornography because it's hard to define in writing and get agreement, but I know it when I see it. And in other words, sustainability is often in the eye of the beholder and their specific context and their knowledge and framework and where they're coming from, and it reflects their fears and hopes and desires. So sustainability is one of those things that really is in the eye of the beholder, and that makes it a challenge. But I think it's worth working at getting an understanding of how we can apply the concept of sustainability to bioenergy, given the important role it has to play. I think that starting with a coalition of the willing, like I think we are doing through a BioFuture platform, and reaching out more to some of the other groups, and including the social justice NGOs in this process, could be very important and productive. And I'll stop there because I know we are short on time. Thank you. It's been an honor to participate here.
It's great, Keith. Thank you for that. So when I saw Paulo Franco's keynote and Thelma Krug's and the roadmap with the huge amount of things that need to happen for net zero to be reached, so this is indeed a challenge that we need to take. Even for all those subjective perceptions, we need to have a working arrangement that people can get behind and have policy stability. So Inge, your work is focused on gaining trust. So you get the last word on this.
Yes, I will maybe address the comment by Jerry first, that that people tend to trust brands, and I agree that this is what happens. But in the beginning of when the first certification systems or labels rather emerged, there were many accusations of greenwashing because these systems did not have systems with third-party auditing. So somehow it needs to be behind it. Otherwise, you quickly get into this. Like I said before, if you don't have the documentation in place, you are prone to manipulation, and if that is discovered, you lose more than you gain in the end. But then I would maybe also say that you need to pay attention to the processes and support what was already said. Continue to engage, be patient. That's what I'm hearing experienced colleagues say also in the sector and in policy. Just continue, be patient, and continue communication with people respectfully, and in fair and transparent processes that are truthful, honest, and all that those concepts that we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So reaching the end of this panel, and let it be known that this panel is just the first step on a process. So we will all be hearing more of this. We will depend on the knowledge of those who have spoken today and many more. So this work is in the priorities of the BioFuture platform initiative for also the US chair that has already announced it as a priority for the next biennium under their leadership, and will surely be working on this going forward. So thank you so much for participating. I want to announce the results of our little poll on how to best promote sustainable bioenergy deployment while addressing land use change emissions. And it turns out that policies policies and a combination of measures in project level certification, along with land management policies at global, national, local levels, they trump modeling. So by far, at least in our poll, policies trump modeling. They are the winners here in the best ways on how to advance this work. So get a look at the details in the Hoover system. We will also be available to answer your questions later on. Our speakers are free also to engage themselves in writing in the Q&A system in Hoover. And finally, stay alert. Thanking all our panelists today for the other sessions in this conference, this BioFuture Summit and BBEST conference. This was just the first live panel. Tomorrow, a critical live panel will discuss one of the other important priorities of the BioFuture platform, which is the policy blueprint. It will discuss the results of the blueprint in the pilot phase and discuss next steps. Tomorrow, a little bit later, a specific panel on the benefits of bioplastics, which is also a continuation of this one, but in a very much more specific context on bioplastics and life cycle, what it means, bio-based materials. And finally, in our third day, the wrap-up live plenary where the chairs from the many conferences, those pre-recorded conferences, panels, dozens of panels, some of the most important aspects, transportation, finance, the sustainability debate here and other aspects will be put together. It's a session of sessions to be followed by the official closing of the conference on Wednesday. And aside from that, all those panels offered to you via the Hoover platform to engage at any time of your preference. So thank you again. Have a good day and see you later.